Okay, very briefly, I just wanted to mention something. One of the questions that I had at lunch yesterday was about the application of qualifications, and we were saying one of the reasons that Tsongkhapa gives for claiming that Baba Viveka had an inferior view of emptiness to Chandrakirti was that Baba Viveka, when he said things have no essential character, he would always say they have no essential character ultimately. And so why does he put that in there? He must think that they have essential character conventionally, even though Baba Viveka never says that they do. So in discussing this, and then also other issues in the Great Treatise, Volume 3, Tsongkhapa, spends quite a bit of time talking about these adverbs, and not just adverbs, but other kinds of phrases that add a qualifying meaning to statements of negation. And he tries to delineate, well, he does delineate, I think, extremely clearly exactly when it's appropriate to add these things and why, and when it's not appropriate. And in this case with Baba Viveka is a case where it would be appropriate not to add it, because you're implying that you have, this reification because you keep adding this qualification to your negation. But in many other cases, Tsongkhapa is on the other side of the fence when he's looking at things like the Heart Sutra, for example. And he understands that these things don't exist. It's not that form doesn't exist at all. It's within emptiness, or from the point of view of ultimate reality, or from the point of view of the mind realizing the final nature of thing, no such forms appear. So that, in Tsongkhapa's understanding, is like saying, well, when you're looking at things from an ultimate point of view, you don't see conventional phenomena. That doesn't mean that they don't exist at all. They don't exist in the point of view of a mind that's looking at the ultimate nature of reality. And he says that doesn't destroy them, just the way not being able to find sounds doesn't destroy them no matter how much you look with your eye consciousness. They still have a kind of existence. It's not a kind of existence that has anything that's answerable to the question, what is it really? But there's a lot of other important questions that we could ask about. Is it a cat or a hat, and so forth, and so forth. And those kinds of questions require analysis. It just doesn't respond to that question. So anyway, I mentioned in that discussion that the Buddha actually addresses this himself in a sutra, and says, when I say things don't exist, I mean they didn't exist intrinsically. And does Buddha is quoted in a sutra as giving the same kind of gloss, and say, you shouldn't think that I'm saying nothing exists when I say nothing exists. When I say nothing exists, you should have figured out by now that I mean things don't exist by way of their own nature. And that quote appears, it took me a little while to find, is on page 188 in volume 3 of the Great Treatise. And it turns out it's a quote from the Lankavatara Sutra that Tsongkhapa picks up right away because Chandrakirti quotes it in his Clear Words, Prasanapada, which is his commentary on the Nagarjuna's fundamental treatise. And the line is very simple. Buddha is speaking and he says, Mahamati, thinking that they are not produced intrinsically, I said that all phenomena are not produced. Well, it seems pretty clear. And then Tsongkhapa is making an argument and say, well, once Buddha says something like that, you don't want to be an idiot and just say, well, he didn't say it this time. He's making it clear that when the force of this qualification carries over to other occasions, and he's not going to. And then he goes on to say, sometimes the texts will say, from the point of view of analysis or under analysis, nothing exists. And so it's like when that's the same as saying things don't exist ultimately, or things don't exist by way of their intrinsic character. Because in that context, analysis means ultimate analysis that searches for the final nature of things and finds that nothing's graspable. So it's not destroying the thing itself, by saying in that way. So anyway, there's a lot on that page has the sutra quote, but then Tsongkhapa later has a whole section that doesn't quote that sutra but goes into a lot more detail on that issue, and that section starts on page 217. So anyway, I just thought I'd mention that. There's other things that came up at lunch or in between that, but I'm not going to go back to all of them. But I thought I would do that since it's I think useful to people in terms of like reading these kinds of blanket negations, like such as the ones that we're chanting, and understand, well, this is how Tsongkhapa understands what's being talked about. Okay, so I wanted to start today by reading some from the Uttara Tantra, Mahayana Uttara Tantra Sastra, which is also known as the Ratna Gotra Vibhaga. So this is like a really famous, important Sanskrit treatise that is associated, they call it one of the 5 treatises associated with a Sangha, which is, in other words, it comes from a Sangha's hand, but it's understood as not being like his personal composition, but rather something that he got from Maitreya. And it has a very, it's accepted by Gelugpa and by the people we're going to talk about today, the Jonangpas. It has a very different kind of approach, if you read it, than other kinds, say, reading the Heart Sutra. And gives you sort of the other side of Buddhism besides just saying everything's emptiness all the time. All right. So I'm just going to read some sections of this starting on page 20. And maybe I'll give a little bit of commentary, but not a lot. It's more a question of just seeing where people, different schools might want to go with this. Buddha is without beginning, middle, or end. He is peace itself, fully self-awakened and self-expanded in Buddhahood. Having reached this state, he shows the indestructible permanent path. Skipping down. Being uncreated and spontaneously present and not a realization due to extraneous conditions. Wielding knowledge, compassion, and love and ability, Buddhahood has the qualities of the 2 benefits. So Buddhahood is presented as something that's uncreated, spontaneously present, not a realization attained through extraneous circumstances, without beginning or middle or end, and self-awakened. Its nature, it being Buddhahood, is without beginning, middle, or an end. Hence, the state of Buddhahood is uncreated. It must be realized through self-awareness, not a realization due to extraneous conditions. Okay, so let's let that stand. This is a text that's used throughout all different types of Tibetan Buddhism. It's an important text. And so that's the first jewel. Second jewel, the Dharma, neither existent nor non-existent, neither non-existent nor existent. It is not both and is not neither. It is therefore inaccessible to investigation and cannot be defined. It's self-aware and peaceful. Inconceivable. Well, let's go down to the last verse. Not being an object of conceptual investigation, inexpressible, only known by noble ones, right? The Dharma is inconceivable, is peace, free from the 2 veils, free from, which probably means like the 2 obstructions, free from thought, and in 3 aspects of purity and so forth, it's similar to the sun. Okay, that's the second jewel. Third jewel. This mind being by nature clear light, they have seen the poisons to be essenceless, and therefore truly realize the nature of everything as being peace, the ultimate non-existence of a self. They perceive that the perfect Buddha pervades them all. Okay, so I always teach in my Buddhism class, I'm going to go to the next section on 3 refuges in a second, but I always teach in my Buddhism class, when I teach beginning Buddhism to beginning students, I explain the Buddha, the Dharma, and Sangha, and it's then we talk about which one's most important, which one's the true refuge, and we always talk about that in terms of, what I've learned in more than one different Buddhist tradition. And that is the Dharma is the actual refuge within 3 jewels. But, that's not the teaching of the Mahayana Uttara Tantra Sastra, as you'll see here in a second. So the 3 refuges. The Dharma will be, second verse, the Dharma will be abandoned and is of an unsteady nature, and it is not the ultimate quality, and the Sangha is still with fear. Thus, the two aspects of the Dharma and the assembly of noble ones do not represent the supreme refuge. They are refuge, but they're not the refuge within the refuge, like I was thinking of the Dharma as normally we talk about the Dharma as the refuge. It's not constant and stable. It's, notice how there was so much emphasis on Buddha being permanent, eternal, uncreated, without beginning, middle, and end in the first section. In a true sense, only the Buddha is being's refuge. Okay, so this is the teaching of Maitreya to Sangha. Let's go over to near the top of the next page 23.
Yeah.
When
they talk about Buddha, are they talking about Buddha Shakyamuni, or are they talking about like the archetype of a Buddha?
I think it's safe to say they're not talking about like a human person, Buddha Shakyamuni.
Okay.
I wouldn't want to use the word archetype either. Yeah. This is a big question. It's like, okay, what is this Buddha that's eternal, essentially, right, and permanent? Like, for example, when His Holiness was teaching at Lehigh, he made reference to this text a few times, but when he talked about the Buddha, he repeatedly quoted Dharmakirti as saying, in his verse of praise to the Buddha, that he became a Buddha due to doing X, Y, Z. And he quoted that 2 or 3 different times, and he said, Buddha was once like us, and then accumulated certain causes and conditions, and the practice of the path, attained the sublime condition, and it's, within our capacity to attain that too, if we set out and do this. It's not easy, but, it's something that you become, all right? But then there's obviously another way of talking about what Buddha is, right? And so, I don't know, in English we usually call this Buddha nature. And that's how they translate it here in the next, they call it Buddha element here on page 23. The Buddha, so when they're talking about Buddha, I take it that they're talking about this Buddha element or Tathagata Garbha that is in us all. Okay? The Buddha element is pure and yet has affliction. Enlightenment was not afflicted and yet is purified. So that's like a paradox, right? Qualities are total, let's see, and then go down to the fourth element. The perfect Buddha body is all embracing. Suchness cannot be differentiated. All beings have the disposition, and thus they have the Buddha nature. So what does it mean, the Buddha element? We're taking the Buddha that they're praising as the supreme refuge is this Buddha element that's within everybody, not like the person of Shakyamuni who, that appeared at a certain point in time. But it's something that has no beginning or end, right? And this is being talked about in terms of the Buddha element, something that's pure ultimately, yet is associated with affliction in our case, right? So all beings, this is kind of the important thing in the fourth Vajra point, all beings have the disposition, and thus they always have the Buddha nature. This pure, uncreated, permanent Buddha is something, what do you say, that we have within us, or which we have a disposition to or nature of in some sense within us. Okay, the Buddha has said that all beings have the Buddha nature, and then quoting a sutra, but it doesn't say which one, since Buddha wisdom is always present within the assembly of beings, since this defiled nature is free from duality, and since the disposition to Buddha has been named after its fruit. So this is an interesting line. It's like saying the disposition to Buddhahood has been named after its fruit. It's like, in other words, it seems to be saying that, we call it the Buddha nature not because it is a Buddha, but because it's a disposition that leads to the result of being a fully enlightened Buddha. That's how I read that. But there's some complications. First of all, in some aspects of Buddha, say the Dharmakaya, are not actually like, you can't really say Buddha is not per se a result. The attainment of Buddhahood, though, is a result. So if you put in that gloss, that's like a distinction. Just like we were talking about nirvana yesterday. Nirvana is, considered to be an ultimate truth. But so you attain a state of mind that's associated with nirvana. But if nirvana is understood as the emptiness of a mind that has been purified of an affliction, then you don't actually attain emptiness, because it's not, a thing that's, but you can attain a certain state of mind, right, with it's free of an affliction, and it's always been empty. So now it's like cleaned up the affliction, and it's also fundamentally pure of any intrinsically existent affliction. It has no conventionally existent affliction on top of and allowing to shine out the fundamental radiance of there being never having been any inherently existent affliction. Right? Okay, so that's the idea of how this is thought about. And then let's just look at a little bit more. The top of page 25. If the Buddha element were not present, there would be no remorse over suffering, no longing for nirvana, and no striving or devotion toward this aim. So it's sort of like they're suggesting that this is what makes the fact that we have this disposition or lineage or embryo or potential or nature within ourselves that is like makes it possible for us to attain Buddhahood. That's what makes it possible for us to aspire to become Buddhahood, because we really have this potential to become Buddhas. Sort of like, I don't know, it's sort of inspiring and hopeful idea, right? Focusing on that, like, well, you're not a Buddha, but you fundamentally there's no graspable essence of not being able to become a Buddha, or even any graspable essence of not being a Buddha in you right now, right? So
this is like in Nyingma. This seems to be much more emphasized in the Nyingma practices,
right?
The Yogic practices. I mean, it seems like every single side note makes some reference
to this kind of idea.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, that's why I thought we did Gelugpa yesterday, and it's not, we did it all last year when I was here. So, I mean, it occurred to me that, this is a text that we don't really read that much in Gelugpa, even though, I've seen, when I was in India, I saw monks Gelugpa monks do read this text. It's not that they don't study this text, but you're right, it's not one of the things that's foregrounded, and it becomes more important in Gelugpa as you do into tantric things instead of the regular kind of sutra curriculum. And I think that's a relevant point, even though this isn't a tantric text. But it has an influence, in later Mahayana sutras and in the tantras, to just start thinking in terms of the ultimate as being this Buddha within, in some sense, not literally, but in some sense, a kind of Buddha within or Buddha potential within, rather than focusing on the ultimate in terms of a lack or an absence. Okay?
This is like when you start getting to the I wouldn't say higher tantra is not true, but when you get into some of the more, they also goes to the solid.
Exactly. So one of the things is that the reason we don't hear about this as much in Gelugpa as you do, not just in Nyingma, but in all of the other orders, is because I think that tantric stuff is more integrated. It's not like Tsongkhapa draws a bright line. When he writes this 3-volume great treatise on the stages of the path of enlightenment, and Vajrayana only gets mentioned like on the last page. He says, if you've done all this stuff, then you should be like, doing their preliminary practices and entering into the Tantra path. And he says that, it's pretty clear, but it's like, he doesn't want to discuss that, mix it up. He is insisting on not mixing it up. And then when he writes about Tantra, he just like, okay, now we're going to do the Tantras. He considers them to be distinct systems, and they play a role in the spiritual progress of one person, but he doesn't. He has them divided up in terms of he's not going to use the Tantras to make sense out of what the sutras say and so forth. But it's clear that not everybody does it like that. In fact, Gelugpa is more unusual in Tibetan Buddhism. And of course, Tantra comes into the way people are reading and understanding texts like this. And in fact, I think texts like this have an influence on developing ideas that are present in the Tantras. Well, let's read a little bit more. The last 3 verses on 25. Based upon the manifestation of suchness, suchness being like ultimate reality, right? Dividing into that of an ordinary being, a noble being, and a perfect Buddha, he who sees thatness, that would be Buddha, has explained the nature of the victor, that would be Buddha also, to beings. So, and in that this nature of the victor, that would mean Buddha nature, essentially, right? Since victor is just standing in for Buddha. The Buddha nature manifests in different ways. Sometimes the Buddha nature, the reality or suchness or Buddha nature manifests as an ordinary being. Sometimes it manifests as a noble being. Sometimes it manifests as a perfect Buddha. And why does it manifest in different ways? Because through perverted views in ordinary beings, through reversal of those in the nobles who see the truth, and as freedom from elaborations in a Tathagata, that is a fully enlightened Buddha. So the unpurified, that's us, the both purified and unpurified, that's the nobles on the path, and the utterly purified phases are expressed in their given order by the names being, Bodhisattva, and Tathagata. So I mean, you can have different ways of reading this, okay? But one way of reading it is to say it's like, okay, at the level of suchness or ultimate reality, we're all Tathagata Buddhas, but that some of these Tathagata Buddhas manifest as ordinary unenlightened sentient beings, and some manifest as bodhisattvas on the path, and some manifest as what they actually are. I'm not saying that's the right Tsongkhapa way to read it, but couldn't you read it that way? It seems to sort of say something like that to me. Okay, so then there's some examples. There's lots and lots of examples. We can't go through, but there's to try to think about this. So the first example at the top of 34 is to say like how there's like a husk and a what do you call it? The grain that's inside the husk, and so it's like the grain that's inside the husk represents, right, the Buddha within, and the husk is our outer shell. And so this is the idea of like threshing as a process of the path is a threshing process. Now it's not a creating, it's not like we're not a Buddha and we have to like make ourselves into something we're not. It's we have this like little grain, Buddha grain inside our husk, and we have to like scrape off the husk to let the Buddha light shine out. It's very different from the Gelugpa way. You have the usual Gelugpa way, certainly the Sutra Gelugpa way of talking about things. So that's one example. Then in the next example, well, let's read the last 2 lines there. That the Lord of qualities, Buddha, is present within all beings. So Buddha is present within all beings, but his body is not liberated from the shrouds of the poisonous, the afflictions. So here's an example. A man was traveling, gold that he owned fell into a place filled with rotten refuse. This gold, being of an indestructible nature, remained for many centuries just as it was. Then a god with completely pure divine vision saw it there and addressed a man, I guess not the same man, purify this supremely precious gold lying here in this filth and convert it into something that's worth being made from such a precious substance. Okay, and so this is like the idea, of course, is that we all have this treasure within our house, the house of our own body, mind, the house of our own aggregates has this precious treasure. We're rich beyond measure, but we don't know it because we haven't found the treasure that's inside our own house. So this is like frequently quoted, not just in Tibet, but in East Asian Buddhism as well. or not even just quoted, just like used as a story without even mentioning where it's from. Skipping down to the verses near the bottom of the same page. If an inexhaustible treasure were buried in the ground beneath a poor man's house, the man would not know it, and the treasurer would not speak to him and say, "I'm here, down in the basement." Likewise, a precious treasure is contained in every being's mind. This is its true state, free from defilement. Nothing is to be added and nothing is to be removed. That's actually a famous line. You know, it's perfect just in itself without adding anything or subtracting anything. Nevertheless, we, not realizing this, continuously undergo manifold sufferings of deprivation. So, the sage, the great sage, Buddha, takes birth within the world to cause us to realize, Shakyamuni now we're talking about, takes birth in the world to help us realize that we have this treasure in our basements that we didn't know about. Okay, so there's a lot of other examples. The Uttara Tantra Sastra is not short on examples. It has a whole bunch more similes like that one to think about, you know, this idea of Buddha nature. Now, what does this? Just say quickly, the Gelugpa idea about what does a Gelugpa Sutra interpretation of this? What would Tsongkhapa say? You say, okay, yes, you absolutely do have a Buddha nature, and what is that Buddha nature? It is not a fully enlightened Buddha sitting inside your chest waiting to pop out. What it refers to is that you have a mind that is empty of inherent existence, whereby your mind has nothing that differentiates it at the ultimate or essential level from a Buddha, and moreover has the capacity to be transformed, given the correct causes and conditions being brought together, into anything that's possible to exist, including ultimately the greatest thing that it can be transformed into, and that is a completely and fully enlightened Buddha. So you have consciousness, and that consciousness is empty. And so therefore you have that's all there is, not like some other little secret compartment that's, you know, the extra aggregate, or you know what I'm saying, or something that's behind the aggregates. It's the conscious, ever-changing, empty consciousness is what the fact that our minds, because they're empty, are ultimately non-different from the mind of a Buddha and have the capacity to be transformed into a mind of Buddha. That's what this is talking about. That's the whole. I mean, you can explain just adding a word here, subtracting a word there. I mean, some passages in here read really well with that interpretation, and they contradict other interpretations, where other passages seem to require a little bit of interpretation in order to make that work. I mean, either way, there's not like it's not. It's clear that, you know, Maitreya, Asanga had some, you know, powerful a religious message, you know, a vision to put across. Our questions about maybe exactly what that means in a sort of Gelugpa terminology weren't the ones that were being asked at the time. So it then creates susceptibility to different interpretations. Okay, so now today, in the next hour, I'm going to introduce you to the interpretation that was really, really popular in Tibet at the time Tsongkhapa was born, in the middle of the 14th century. It was so popular that when it was being preached, people would come in crowds like Beatlemania or something. There was like they would break the doors because not everybody could get through, and just knock out a wall of a building so that everybody could see. And they would like all be on the stairway, you know, on the side until the stairway collapsed. And, you know, there was like just a rage for an interpretation that, you know, in part derives from this text. Of thinking of us as ultimately being full, completely enlightened Buddha with all of the qualities of a Buddha at the ultimate level. Okay, so This is called Jonong, or the system. It's a system that still exists today. It's not one of the four that we usually hear about. When the Dalai Lama says all of the four major well-known systems of Tibetan Buddhism have the same Prasangika view ultimately, one of the ones that he's not counting is Jonong, right? He doesn't mention it as being one of the four that has the same view. And that's intentional. It's not like he forgot about it. Like at Lehigh, he talked about all the different orders and how it was important to have, an appreciation, understanding, and study and practice them. But when he was saying that, he didn't mention Jonong. And later, he did make an allusion to Jonong and its existence as part of the religious heritage of Tibet. But of course, that also includes Burn and Tibetan Muslims, and there's no implication that everybody should go out and practice all of these things. That when he's talking about what people should be practicing, he's suggesting specifically, that for Buddhists that they shouldn't be restricting themselves to like this particular Gelugpa isn't like going to be contaminated if they practice some Kagyupa. That's what he was trying to say, and he's been really like adamant about that. As I was saying, he considers it an issue of religious freedom that people, not tell you not to study a Nyingma text because your teacher's Gelugpa.
So what happened to Jonong, or how is it portrayed, or
we're going to find out. If we don't get through it this morning, we'll go over into this afternoon and I'll tell you the whole story. It's really interesting. Okay, so the supposed beginnings of this are with in terms of it existing as a sect in Tibet. And this goes back beyond what we can demonstrate historically. Was a Kashmiri yogi named Somanatha. And this guy taught Kalachakra to a Tibetan, Kalachakra Tantra, and some associated practices to a Tibetan whose name was Yumo Mikyur Dorje, who lived in the 11th century. So this happened in the 11th century. So this is the same time that Buddhism was going through the second diffusion in Tibet. It's like a little bit after Atisha and so forth. So this Yumo Mikyur Dorje just like took the teachings that he got from his Kashmiri yogi teacher, and he went into retreat and meditated on them. And he didn't publish any books. But I should mention that there's a very famous person named Mikyur Dorje who's one of the Karmapas, and this is not that person. This is that's why I was like, Yumo Mikyur Dorje is like a much more obscure person who didn't write anything. And he was just this yogi who supposedly got the transmission from Kashmir of this. So he's not actually even saying that he got this view of other emptiness. It's what it's called, or Shendong, that becomes characteristic of Jonong. He's not saying he got this view from Somanatha. He realized it in meditation on Kalachakra after he'd been initiated into Kalachakra by Somanatha. So he's in the mountains in Tibet. He's a yogi in the mountains of Tibet, and he has an experience, a very profound experience, which he doesn't initially talk about, but just teaches it to his students. And then his students are not scholars, they're yogis, and they teach it to their students. And their students are not scholars, they're yogis, and they practice this and teach it to their students. So it's not famous. It's just like there are no books about it. It's just something that some yogis have come to understand, through their practice in the mountains. Until you come down to the 14th century, and it was made famous by a guy who was both a great scholar and a great yogi. And his name was Dolphova. So his full name is Gunkyén Dolphova Sherap Gyaltsen. Dolphova means he's the guy from Dolpo. Dolpo is like in part of Nepal, right? So Gunkyén means omniscient. So he was like, everybody called him omniscient because he was so smart. And Sherap Gyaltsen was his regular name. Dolphova, just the guy who's from Dolpa. The guy from Dolpo. So we just call him Dolphova. Lived from 1292 to 1361. So that means that he, 13, 16, yeah, so his lifespan was like just before Tsongkhapa's, right? So he was born to a Nyingma family. They were practicing tantras in, it was Nyingma yogis who were not celibate, and they were practicing tantras, and he was like studying tantras and mastering tantras like when he was 5 and 6 and so forth. That's what we're told. And then he, somewhat against his parents' wishes, determined to become a monk and get an education, and his teacher was a Sakya, and his teacher was called from Nepal to Tibet, and he eventually went with his teacher and studied in central Tibet, even though he's from Nepal. And so he went around and studied and learned everything, and he proved to be just like a prodigy, not just at like learning all these tantras, but also at mastering all the sutra texts as well. So by the time he was 22, he had toured all over central Tibet and had won so many debates that they started calling him the omniscient one. Maybe it was a little sarcastic. You wonder, it's like, anyway. But there's like, oh, this 22-year-old guy is coming around beating the monks in debate, so they started calling him omniscient. And so he just went, he studied with, by the time he was 29, he'd taken teachings from 30 different Tibetan teachers, and he was the dominant, in terms of scholarly mastery of the Buddhist literature, he was a dominant person of Tibet of the time. And then, so he's going around to different places looking for teachings he hadn't gotten, and he went to this monastery called Jonong, or we just call it Jonong, usually, Jonong, J-O-N-A-N-G. And this is a monastery somewhat to the eastern side of Tibet. He was humbled for the first time when he went there, because he realized that he says, all the men and women there had realized the ultimate nature of reality in meditation. It was very clear that that was not what he'd been doing. He'd been studying and debating Tantra and Sutra, but he hadn't been like focusing on the yogi aspect of it. So he then went back, he visited there, and then he went away and quickly came back and started practicing Kala Chakra there at Jonong. And doing that, he very quickly had this realization of whatever it was, Shendong, this kind of understanding of emptiness and ultimate reality that had been the tradition of that monastery, passed down from Yumon Dorje or so forth. So within 5 years after that, he'd become abbot of Jonong Monastery, and he started building a great stupa, a huge stupa. And at the same time he was building it, he was also writing his massive magnum opus, which is published and translated in English now by Jeffrey Hopkins, called Mountain Doctrine. And it took him, 5 or 6 years, but when he finished, then he started teaching openly this teaching which had been not taught openly before, based on this text. The understanding you get is like, okay, well, these yogis always had this experience and realization, but they needed a scholar yogi to come along before they could really go public with it and explain it and justify it and defend it in the arena of Tibetan Buddhism against other points of view. So this stupa, anyway, he was very focused on the building of this stupa and very devoted to it, and he finished it in 1333, and then it was restored by Taranatha. I don't know if you've heard of Taranatha, but he's like one of the few Tibetan scholars who took a Sanskrit religious name. So he's a Tibetan, but his name is Taranatha, and he was the second greatest Jonong scholar after Dolphova. He restored the stupa in 1621, and then it was refurbished again in 1990. So I've seen a picture of it. I mean, it exists. It's it's a remarkable, complicated-looking stupa. So at this time also I said he published his big book, The Mountain Doctrine, and he starts teaching this doctrine of Shendong. Some people seem to know this word, Shendong. So you know Shendong, even though you don't in general know Tibetan, but you know Shendong.
Shendong His Holiness talked a little bit about Shendong in Los Angeles a few years ago, and I had the Handbook of Tibetan Culture.
And they put that word in there?
And that was in the glossary, and so we were passing it up and down the road trying to figure out what His Holiness was talking about.
Oh, I see.
That's my entire... Leah has a little bit more knowledge.
Well, and just a teeny tad. I mean, I've read this Progressive Stages on Meditation and Emptiness by Tsongkhapa.
I see.
That's my familiarity.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Shen means other, and dong is the word for empty. Dongba ni means emptiness. So dong means empty. It's the same empty of emptiness. And Shen means other. So usually when we talk about emptiness, when we in Gelugpa talk about emptiness, and most of the time emptiness, as I've understood it in the past, always meant that something was empty of its own essential nature or ultimate nature or substantial nature, or at least it's a permanent nature, or it's empty of something, some exaggerated thing in it that we think it has that it doesn't really have, and the lack of that thing, which we stupidly think that it has but it really doesn't, and thereby get ourselves into a lot of trouble, that lack is called emptiness, okay? And so it's something that's missing within the thing itself that is emptiness, okay? And then Shendong doesn't mean that. So then it gets very confusing. People are not even sure exactly how to translate it, emptiness of the other or other emptiness. And so what it means is that we have conventional phenomena in the Shendong view are self-empty. That is like tables, chairs, us. We're empty of our own entities, as the Dolphova would put it. But the ultimate real nature, which could also be called the Tathagata Garbha or the Buddha nature, is not empty of its own nature. It's not empty of itself. It exists ultimately. But it's still called empty because it's empty of all of these conventional things. And that's why it's called other emptiness. So these things, conventional things that we associate with are self-empty, and they're also called self-emptinesses. Whereas the actual reality of things as they are, the ultimate and true nature, is not empty of its own nature. It's empty of these falsely appearing delusory things, these coarse conventional phenomena. Okay? Do you follow? It's like really different from the Gelugpa way. Okay? So that's a basic idea. We'll go into a little bit more. But anyway, so Dolphova comes to Lhasa for 6 months after he writes this book. On the way there, he visits and seems to have influenced one of the leaders of the Sakya sect, and at the request of this person writes a book called A Calculation of the Doctrine Having the Significance of a Fourth Council. So this is like, in other words, he was, by that time people were calling him the Buddha from Dolpo, and he calls his second book a book, having the meaning of a fourth council. In other words, this pulls together all the scriptures and the meaning of the scriptures, just as it has the significance of a fourth council, where all the sutras were being put together. It's a little, we could say, audacious in his titling, right? So then this is when everybody mobs him, when he spends 6 months in Lhasa after he comes out with these publications. And everybody, it's just the rage, and everybody's like swarming to hear him. And so this idea has a lot of influence down to the present day. That's why it's in the glossary that's being passed around. It's, even though Jonong is like a small sect, and why it's small, you know, we'll talk about it. It's like, that's interesting. But the influence has been very wide, and what people mean by other emptiness may be different in different teachings. They may not, I think we'll see, maybe they don't all mean the same thing as what Dolphova means by it. But the idea of talking about other emptiness, a kind of emptiness which is not the thing being emptied out of its own essence, but things being empty in the sense of they're being distant and cut off from something else. That becomes a really important and influential idea, and you have this, you know, tension then, and sometimes attempt to create fusions and syntheses between the idea of things being self-empty and in some sense, and things being other empty in another sense. And that's like, you know, Sidney Pyburn at Snow Lion told me that about half of the people who read Snow Lion books, when they hear emptiness, what they're thinking of is some form of other emptiness. And I'm like, oh, well, that's interesting, because my book's not about that. But the only time it mentions it, it's Tsongkhapa trashing it, you know. So, yeah.
So if you trained in like this philosophy at this monastery, and you had a realization of emptiness,
Yeah.
and then if someone trained at, you know, under Tsongkhapa and had a realization of emptiness,
Yeah.
would they be realizing the same thing, since the conceptual view is different?
They would be, I don't know. It's like one of the questions, do Christians and Jews and Muslims pray to the same God? Well, I don't know, I'll use my divine eye.
We're all trying to become Buddhas, and, you know, it's like, but there's all these different views of what we're trying to realize.
No, let me just say, I'll say this, like I answered at two levels. First, at the conceptual level, when Dolphova talks about the way in which conventional phenomena, which is like most things that we're concerned with, are empty, his view is not exactly the same as Tsongkhapa's, but it has a lot of commonality. I mean, and so in other words, he thinks that we reify things, exaggerate how they exist, and then by becoming attached to that. But he would say, well, Dolphova would say, well, if you go and practice with Tsongkhapa, you'll realize that, and you'll realize that these things are empty of their own self-nature, and that will help you temporarily suppress your coarser afflictions. But you won't become enlightened because you haven't realized this other emptiness. Okay? That would be what Dolphova would say to Tsongkhapa about, you know, you practicing at Tsongkhapa's place. And Tsongkhapa would say that this is actually what he does say. It's in the Great Treatise. He says, okay, well, the root of all of your suffering in cyclic existence is this exaggerated conception of how these phenomena that you're interacting with actually exist. That's what causes you the problem when you're seeing someone who's doing what you don't want, and then you reify them as being naturally evil, and that interacts with your wishes to harm them and so forth. And so this is, we have to like get at the root of what's actually is this exaggerated conception of how these things exist. And if somebody says, oh, well, you know, that's true, but it's not really very important. You should meditate on this really sublime, you know, thing over here. It's not going to like be getting at the actual root of cyclic existence. He really doesn't mince words. He doesn't name names, but he doesn't mince words. He really thinks it's a bad idea. And he says like this, it's like if someone's afraid and terrified and suffering because they think that there's a snake in the wall of their house, and then instead of like helping them like analyze and look into the situation with the snake over in the eastern wall and like seeing whether there's really a snake there, you say, oh, don't worry about that snake, just let's look over here at the you know, mongoose that's over here on the other side of the house. Well, that's what he actually says. This is like he's just making fun of it. In other words, he's saying this is like simple. So in Tsongkhapa's way, I don't even think that he thinks Dolphova is as good as Dolphova. He thinks that this is just like going off down totally the wrong direction. So that's the conceptual level. They totally disagree with each other about what you need to realize in order to become liberated from cyclic existence. But there's another level, because you kind of asked it as like if you're a yogi and you realize emptiness. Okay, well this is like a different question. Because like it's not just a few people, Jonong is small, but it's not just a few people who talk about this other emptiness. So, okay, I personally, this is like about trying to get outside your comfort zone, right, as we were talking about yesterday. My comfort zone is self-emptiness. I have like a bias against the other emptiness view. So, I, for a long time, was like trying to understand why my teacher has spent like the last several years translating the magnum opus by the guy who had the wrong idea. And so I was like talking to people, it's like, well, one way to think about this is that, Gelugpa is very good as we were talking about, from the point of view of where we are now in creating a coherent worldview that makes sense and solves a lot of problems. And that's related to my answer to Kevin's question yesterday afternoon. It's like, well, that's why I like it, because that's, I don't like being confused, and this seems to make things a lot clearer. But what it's not so good at is like presenting things from the point of view of how they're experienced in yogic attainment or how a Buddha would see things. In fact, when you go to definition school, right, dialectic school, and study Gelugpa definitions, they're all, you define things from the point of view of how they appear to ordinary people, which means unenlightened people, which means not how they appear from the point of view of enlightened people. And if you want to know how they appear from enlightened people, you have to like put an exception in there, right? For example, if you want to say form is like something that we would include in the sense of shape and color is something, that we see with our eye consciousness. Well, you can't just define form as something that's perceived by the eye consciousness if you're talking about all beings, because Buddha sees shapes and colors with his omniscient nose consciousness. You know what I'm saying? It's like, and that's just the beginning. I mean, you have like Buddha's omniscience, Buddha's mind, Buddha's in a meditation in the Heart Sutra on the diversity of phenomena or something like that. Well, Buddha's mind that meditates on the diversity of the phenomenal world is an omniscient consciousness that simultaneously realizes emptiness. Even though it's called a meditation on diversity of phenomenal world, it can't only be knowing that because it's a Buddha's mind, so it has to know everything at the same time. So you have this problem that all this kind of trying to divide things up and talk about them in categories and make discriminations clear about what you're talking about just all collapses when you talk about, well, Buddha's consciousness or the non-dualistic realization of ultimate reality by a yogi, all going along the path. And that's what we were talking about yesterday, this idea of ineffable. When you saw how several times the Uttara Tantra talked about things as being inexpressible, the Dharma as being, beyond concepts and so forth. So Gelugpa vocabulary is like helping make things very clear at the conceptual level. But it's called Mountain Doctrine. Sherab Gelsen's big book, Dolpova's big book, is called Mountain Doctrine. He called it Mountain Doctrine because, as I was sort of setting up earlier, it's like this is the definitive meaning as known by people who are meditating in the mountains. It's not like supposed to be, something that's, he's coming from a scholarly point of view into a yogic tradition and saying, now as a scholar, I'm going to tell you what these yogis are really understanding. And it doesn't necessarily match up to these other categories. So a way of thinking about this is that if you want to have a language, and you've probably heard, if you want to have a language that evokes or suggests, to the mind, enlightenment, then you have, Longchenpa and, Nyingma poetry, and you want to have sort of a language that evokes this sense of something that, like, what non-dualistic understanding is like, then you can have some kind of language like this. And it's saying like, well, we have a perfect Buddha within us right now. You can't separate the object. You can't, like if you have a non-dualistic realization of emptiness, Gelugpas immediately say, yeah, you have the mind and you have the emptiness that it's non-dualistically realizing. Yeah, that's because you're standing over here making up a story about it. But that's not the way the person, the yogi's experiencing. Non-dualistic realization of emptiness is not like my mind knowing emptiness. That's exactly what makes it nirvana, is that it doesn't have that aspect to it. You see what I'm saying? So if you start saying, okay, now we know that yogis really have this non-dualistic experience. Let's try to describe things from a non-dualistic point of view, in which the mind and its object are one. Instead of saying that that's contradictory, which Gelugpas will say, and that implies, something that, we can't, the opposite of the good emptiness you need to realize, you're going to say, no, this is the way the highest minds are actually experiencing things, as these dualities have collapsed.
But one of the things that you're running into there is, by him writing this book, it's almost the same as if I were to write a narrative about Beethoven's symphonies. If you don't actually hear the symphonies, you may think you know everything about it because conceptually I explained everything to you, but you didn't really get it. And I think, because I know in the groups when they debate, they say, okay, off limits is the Buddha's mind. I mean, they say that. That's like one of the ground rules.
Because it messes everything up immediately.
So I mean, they'll say that, right?
We're just going to.
Is off limits. Okay, let's talk.
Yeah. Well, otherwise, it's just every definition has to have an exception clause.
Right. Yeah. So
there's this whole history. You've studied Loseling stuff. It's like I was like, should definitions be in Gelugpa books be written just taking it for granted that you're not counting Buddha, or should each definition put in a special clause that takes into account, that it's different if you're a Buddha, or can you just take that as for granted? But I think the point I would take from what you're saying is that, like, what happens if you take yogic experience, instead of just evoking it or trying to train people for it, you try to create a conceptual system and a philosophy, which of course has to be written in dualistic language and use all these same categories, which it's, right? But you're trying to base it on something that is beyond words. You've just finished saying it was beyond words. What Tsongkhapa is saying, oh yeah, that's beyond words, but now what can we say that's clear in words? And then that's his system, right? But then other people aren't happy with that, right? Because they think that that's reifying our attachment to the world as it currently appears. So they want to have a philosophy, but a philosophy that it's emerging directly out of something that's utterly beyond philosophy, by its own definition, right? And that's where you can, I don't know, that's where I would say, it's like, okay, well, if you want to get a sense of what like these yogis are experiencing, maybe it's interesting to read this. But it doesn't, to me, work it doesn't work for me as a philosophy in the way that Tsongkhapa works for me as a philosophy. Do you see what I'm saying? It's like,
I totally agree.
Yeah.
And plus, I think it's dangerous. I mean, I can read all of Rick Steves' travel logs, but that's not going to Europe,
Right. Well, but the thing about that is that people will say, well, these Gelugpas are studying all these books, and then they never get around to meditating on what they're studying anyway, right? So it's not.
So they're always writing the rules, they never play the game.
Well, not everybody's that way. Like some people do, but that's the stereotype, right? And there's some basis for it, yeah.
I was reading some of Alex Berzin's writing, and he seemed to be saying, he seemed to be saying that they were both, other emptiness and self-emptiness are just 2 points of view, but both valid and not inconsistent. And I asked him that question, and he said, yes, they're not at all inconsistent. He said, other emptiness refers to clear light mind, just that. And so, and I was wondering what you think of that, for one thing. And if you do see it that way, it does seem like, I don't know really Dolphova and how solid he's making the other emptiness quality or the Buddha nature quality, but I mean, Gelug's practice Tantra, and they're going after the clear light mind.
Right. Well, Alex Berzin, knows this stuff really well, and so he knows that, the Dalai Lama's position is that there's good Shendong and bad Shendong. And the first thing I figured out about that was that Sherab Gyaltsen had to be in the bad category, Dolphova. Why? Because there's no question that Tsongkhapa takes him as the main person that he criticizes throughout his life's work, his mature life's work. You can't really have Tsongkhapa taking this guy as the main person he's criticizing and then have the Dalai Lama saying, oh yeah, but he was actually right. And what would be wrong? It's not just the fact that he's saying that the core thing that he's saying is this is what unites the four, we did this yesterday, right? Is this prasangika view, and he's saying the prasangika view is that at the conventional level you have to be able to differentiate between dependent arisings, but at the same time you have to say that the ultimate nature is unfindable under analysis. Dolphova doesn't say that. The ultimate nature is findable under analysis. It's ultimately existing, right? So if you say, yeah, there's this sublime thing and it's empty of anything else and that's the ultimate reality, you haven't actually crossed the line yet. You could be talking about the clear light mind and its fundamental emptiness and how they're non-dual from one another, and you can call that the ultimate, even though it's not just a sheer negation, but it includes non-dualistically a subtle mind that's knowing it at that time. The problem is if you say that the reality that the clear light mind is knowing, that is its fundamental nature, that it's knowing non-dualistically, is something that's self-existent, autonomous, and locatable under analysis. Now see, just the fact that this is a question. When something is known by the ultimate mind, does that make it that thing ultimately exists?
Well, it seems like it's a matter of definition, and I wonder if people just are using the word ultimate in different ways.
Well, does it make it so that when we search to say, what is this really with regard to it, that we find it itself as its own finally locatable essence? See, this is what I take it that His Holiness is where, this is the way I understand where he's drawing the line. It's saying, you don't have to say that the ultimate is a sheer negation, but you have to be able to realize that there are no phenomena that are ultimately findable under analysis that searches and asks the question with regard to that phenomena, what is it? So, emptiness is empty, in Gelugpa way. The table is empty. When you search for the table, you find the table's emptiness of inherent existence. That doesn't mean that emptiness is itself ultimately existing, even though it's the final nature of the table. It doesn't exist in and of itself. It exists in dependence upon the table and our mind that posits it, as the final nature of the table. And so it's not like a self-existent reality. So when you turn your mind to the emptiness of the table and say, oh, this must be, the ultimate thing, and search to say, what is the nature of this emptiness of the table, you find that it itself is unfindable. So that's what he's saying. Emptiness of emptiness is not just a way of, talking. It's saying that when you take this as the thing that you're searching for, you can't find it. You don't find it as being its own nature in and of itself. And that's exactly what that's exactly what Sherab Gyaltsen does. That's the line that he crosses.
But you could speak about clear light mind as, no problem. It's self-empty. You can't find it in ultimate analysis when you're looking for it, but I would guess that how could you call clear light mind a negative?
No, that's two different things. Okay, this is that's exactly the point I'm trying to make. There's two things that are involved here. Is the ultimate reality a sheer negation? Gelugpa's wanted to say it is. A lot of other people say not. And question two, is whatever you're calling the ultimate and everything else ultimately unfindable under analysis? Okay, so when you go with the first thing, it's okay, of course, Dolphova is going to say that the ultimate reality is an affirming negative. It's why? Because it's a negative because it's an other emptiness. It's the negation of all these conventional delusory phenomena that appear to us now. But it's an affirming negative because it's permanent, it's self, it's partless, it's findable under analysis. It has, and it's not just like it's also, a mind that's knowing the real nature of things, which exists in and of itself. So it's an affirming negative, and so that in itself, to say that it's an affirming negative isn't the problem. It's that when you say, in addition to being affirmative negative, it's a self-existent affirming negative.
So that, would you differentiate the Jonong view from perhaps the Kagyu Shenton view or other Shenton views in that way?
Well, in general, that is obviously the way His Holiness is going. That's the way he's going. That's why he says in Kindness, Clarity, Insight, and also then at Lehigh, he made it very clear that he was going to, say that all of the four well-known sects of Tibetan Buddhism have in a prasangika view. That means he's going to say that, as he understands it, they're not positing anything that exists in and of itself by way of its own nature. And he's not going to be hung up over this issue of whether what they're calling ultimate is a sheer negation or not, for exactly the reason that you point out. The strong Gelugpa attachment to the idea that the ultimate has to be a sheer negation applies to explaining the Madhyamaka system in the sutra way. And once the Gelugpas get into combining that with Tantra, there's a whole other vocabulary for what counts as ultimate anyway, which is the last essay in Kindness, Clarity, and Insight. So he's saying, look, if you make the basis of comparison something that combines philosophical understanding of Madhyamaka with the vocabulary used in Tantra, you realize that Gelugpas don't have to be hung up on this idea that there has to be what's called the ultimate must be a sheer negation. That's not the sticking point for His Holiness. I mean, you could find some other Gelugpas who say differently, right? But he still wants, to show as the part of the process of becoming enlightened that you've realized that the mind, or whatever it is you're searching for, is unfindable under analysis. You can call that realization something other than the ultimate, as long as you've found that and don't then, found the unfindability of, and then whether you call that the ultimate or not, it doesn't matter as long as you're not claiming that some other thing that is the ultimate does exist in and of itself and is findable. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
That's my understanding.
Isn't this Shiva in the Dolphova way, kind of like circling back down to the Vasubandhu view that, there are stuff that ultimately exists. I mean, it's kind of like negating, what Nagarjuna was trying to do, which is separate us from our attachment on the basis that everything is ultimately empty, so there's nothing to be attached to. I mean, this is like giving you. It sounds to me, and this is what it's sounding to me right now, and I'm totally willing to be wrong about this, but it just sounds to me it's just another. It's just dressing up the donkey in the nurse's clothes and saying, oh look, there's something to be attached to here. There is an ultimate thing that can ultimately be attached to.
Just look at this over here and you'll be free. Yeah. Don't worry about doing all this analysis. Yeah. He doesn't actually say that though, He does want people, he's not one of these, he's not like thinking, oh, we'll be really and quickly enlightened if you just realize the Buddha within. He's not, actually, Dolphova turns out not to be at all like that. There were people, there was this practice in Tibet, and it still goes on, called those like single white remedy and other things, where the idea is that you can become very quickly enlightened just right now by realizing that all your dualistic conceptual thoughts and ordinary behavior are all manifestations of the basic mind. And it's just if you just notice that, then you don't have to do all these other, difficult things. That's called the single white remedy. So Dolphova criticizes that. He doesn't think that at all. He wants people to do all these practices of the path, but he sees that as a process of you're attaining through the practice of the path what he calls like the conventional bodies of a Buddha. Whereas the ultimate bodies of the Buddha, all the ultimate bodies of the Buddha, including the form body and the fearlessnesses and all the powers and And all the aspects of the Buddha have their ultimate forms, which are all already existent and are our true nature.
So that's that could be something that's permanent, but we ordinary beings could become it, because I was thinking, well,
you can't become it in a sense because you already are it. That's one of the things. It's like, so you don't become it in so much as you attain a conventional, at a merely conventional level, you attain Buddha bodies, which allow you your fundamental Buddha nature, which is, with all its qualities, has already been there. Like, he doesn't just say like emptiness is the ultimate reality. That's sort of like the Dharmakaya. That's always in your mind. No, it's like you have like all what we would think is, like the Buddha's mind, the Buddha's pristine wisdom, all the attributes and forms and qualities of a Buddha all exist in ultimate forms right now. And they are self-existent in his way. That's who. So this is like a little bit of a thing that is a little bit challenging in Dolphova. He says that's who we really are. Conventionally, we have these false ideas about who we are. We mistakenly think that we're self, that we're pure, that we're permanent, that we can find happiness or pleasure in grasping at these or those things. And in fact, there is self and purity and happiness to be, but it's like it's not something we have to grasp after in these different things that we seek. It's who we fundamentally always already have been but haven't noticed. Okay? So on the one level, it's who at the ultimate level we already are. But on the other hand, it's empty of who, it's completely, it's other emptiness, which means that it is utterly empty of who we stupidly think we are now. Which is a very interesting thing. It's utterly empty of us, yet at the same time, it's our true nature. So it's utterly empty of all the ideas that we have about who we are now, all these conventional ideas. It's utterly disconnected from those. But at the same time, it is our deepest and truest nature. So I was playing around with a lot about how to think about this. Building off of the Uttara Tantra example about the gold in the house and how to think about this idea. And okay, so just building on the gold idea, suppose you have a person who in fact is living in a beautiful, perfect golden mansion or whatever, the best of all possible residences, right? But they perceive it as being a miserable, sloppy old shack, that's causing them a lot of pain and discomfort. Okay? Okay, it's like that. It's like that. And if you think of it like that, then you see how much it is like Tantra.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's where he was coming from, Dolphova. I mean, he was all
Exactly.
Kala Chakra.
It was all Kala Chakra. He was, he's like, so he quotes dozens and dozens and dozens of sutras, dozens of shastras, like all the Madhyamaka famous people and unfamous people, all of the Chittamatra people, and dozens, maybe 24 or more tantras. It's like it's not just a compendium, but it's comparable to Tsongkhapa's book in that it's like he's mastered all of this literature. He finds all the quotes that support his point of view, and he interprets all the ones that don't. So he tells you, for example, when you find a passage that says the ultimate is the middle way and it itself is empty, then he tells you what he thinks that means from his point of view. There are lots of passages that obviously support Tsongkhapa's view and oppose his view, and just like Tsongkhapa interprets the ones that don't fit with his view, Dolphova goes through and explains all these things. So he has this kind of like comprehensive mastery of all this literature and an argument about how to explain it to fit with his view. But as part of that, the texts that he quotes the most are the commentaries on the Kala Chakra and this Uttara Tantra Shastra are his main touchstones that he goes back to. So he calls this view Madhyamaka, or Mahamadhyamaka. But it's like calling it great Madhyamaka or Madhyamaka. It's like that phrase was very commonly used. Like a lot, Tsongkhapa uses it. It's just like a way of saying, it's just sort of a way of praising. Sometimes Madhyamaka is called Madhyamaka. So, but he uses the name great Madhyamaka, and he also uses the phrase the ultimate mind-only system. So he thinks that really, if you really understand what all the mind-only people are saying and what all of the Madhyamaka people are saying, it can all be explained and interpreted to mean exactly what he's trying to say. And then he shows you. And Jeffrey says, well, he has a little bit of trouble with Chandrakirti, but he does because Chandrakirti has a section where he's actually refuting the idea that the Tathagata Garbha, like the Buddha nature, includes like fully developed form bodies that are, present in a sentient being, and that's exactly what Dolphova is trying to say. But, so he interprets these things as saying, well, when the text says that emptiness itself is empty, then, we have to interpret this, when in fact, of course, I, Dolphova, know perfectly well that it's ultimately existent. Then we have to interpret this, that this is just helping you overcome your gross dualistic conceptions about emptiness. And it's not meaning that these things don't really, they're the final nature. This is the reality that's known by the ultimate mind. There isn't anything beyond it. Right? So it's not a question of it being hollowed out. It's the question of this is our true nature. See what I'm saying? That's what he's saying, the Uttara Tantra shot. This is our true nature. And it's like, well, what's inside the true nature? No, that is the true nature. That's what you come to when you look for what you are. Say, what are you really? You come to this.
Does this apply only?
That's what he says.
The empty nature of beings, or would he say the empty nature of the table is also inherently existing?
I'm a little bit unsure about that. I don't know. I've read everything I could about it, and that was a question that appeared to my mind, but I didn't really see a clear answer in the text. It seems like it's not a focus of his attention, that's for sure. I guess you'd probably say that like a table only appear in relationship to us, and it wouldn't be something that would appear at all, So what does, a Buddha who's enlightened, just like we were talking about, he just like doesn't see, in Dolpova's way, they don't see any of these conventional phenomena. And so a Buddha's mind, in Dolpova's way, that's the pristine wisdom, not an ordinary mind, but a pristine wisdom that's, knowing the true, the other emptiness that is the real nature, or the Tathagata Garbha, it's identical to that which it knows. It's exactly the opposite of the situation where we were talking about yesterday at lunch, where an agent can't be the same as the object. He's saying, well, that is exactly what it is that, and then he say, well, if you say that like the agent can't be the same as the object, even you know perfectly well that it can, because there's reflexive self-awareness that all the ordinary beings have, and that's just an imperfect example of how things can be, act upon themselves in some instances. So of course that's that's another reason for Tsongkhapa to be against reflexive self-awareness. Right?
See where he says this is the fruition of mind only. Then.
Right. Well, in fact, yeah, that turns out to be one of the directions people go in interpreting this, is to say, well, we'll come to that, but here's a prayer that Dolphova wrote. May the Buddhas have pity on those who hold that the whole of Buddha's teachings on emptiness concerns self-emptiness alone, and hold them in their compassion. May the Buddhas have pity on those who hold that the whole of Buddha's teaching on emptiness concerns a non-affirming negation alone, and hold them in their compassion. So it says also that Dolphova explains that ordinary worldly beings believe that they have self-permanence, bliss, and purity, and in fact that they do have these qualities, but are looking for them in the wrong place. They have them in their ultimate nature and not in things that they grasp for outside them in the world. So, let's see. One final thing, a couple on Dolphova. Let's see, we're doing almost out of time. He talks about, he uses tantric, his hermeneutic the way of interpreting these texts is that the Tantras are used to interpret the Sutras. Sutras are used to interpret the Tantras. He does the opposite of Tsongkhapa. Everything is used to interpret everything. And not only that, he finds like within individual texts some passages that he thinks represent, like the Sandhya Vimochana Sutra. He says like some parts of this are the regular mind only, and some are the supreme mind only. So it's not. He has different parts of different texts that he interprets as having different points of view. And in mixing Tantra together with Madhyamaka in this way, he talks about something that Jeffrey translates as the androgynous state. It's maningi kobang. So kobang means state, and maning means, I would translate it as intersexual. It means like, a being who has sexual characteristics of both sexes. Jeffrey translates it as androgynous, taking it as referring to the gender rather than the anatomical sex. Anyway, either way, androgynous or intersexual state. And this is like, comes out of the idea that you have a union of method and wisdom, and the method and wisdom are represented by male and female. So if you have this like self-identical ultimate reality that's a perfect union of method and wisdom, then it's androgynous and or intersexual is a way of talking about that kind of that status. So he has a lot of other kind of interesting vocabulary. Jeffrey says, is sort of summarizing this, he says, Dolpova's perspective draws attention to the mind of reality, its constancy, its fundamental nature, the sense in which it is both under, here, right now, but also beyond the realm of compounded phenomena. Because of an immediate sense of the presence of the Buddha nature, the reader is called to a state in which beings are already grounded right now. We're called to our higher self or something like that. So this idea of, that there's something that's utterly transcendent of us, that is empty of, our coarseness, yet is immanent in who we are right now, that's like a powerful religious vision. And I think it's sort of like, what you're unhappy with about it is that it's like a religious vision of a lot of other religions, and it's different from the distinctive.
Soul to me, man.
Yeah, well, and this is of course exactly what the Gelugpa critics were saying, well, this is, and starting with Rendawa. Okay, Rendawa, Tsongkhapa's teacher, Rendawa says, this is beyond the pale of all Buddhist systems. And he goes through all the Buddhist systems he knows and shows why other emptiness doesn't fit into any of the categories of any of the emptinesses that are taught in any of the systems of the Buddha. And so he's like saying, this is like beyond the pale. Rendawa read Mountain Dharma 3 times. And they said, the first time he really didn't like it. And the second time he was amazed and impressed and really liked it. And the third time he went back to his original opinion. And I think he passed that judgment on to Tsongkhapa, and Tsongkhapa carried it forward. And some of the rhetoric that Tsongkhapa uses against Dolpova's point of view in the Great Treatise, 1402, which is Tsongkhapa's first major mature work, it just echoes exactly what his teacher Rendawa had said about beyond the pale. That phrase, like being beyond the pale, comes from Rendawa into Tsongkhapa.
But if you do use the pure light mind interpretation rather than this transcendent, permanent, actually existing or whatever thing,
Yeah.
It seems to take on a whole different thing.
Well, yeah, and that's what.
That is a soul at all.
Well, no, and I think that's why. His Holiness is trying to be the Dalai Lama of all the Tibetans, but at the same time, he hasn't actually included all of them in his broad statement about all having the Prasangika view. So, he's been. It turns out, there are a lot of not just people who have a Shendong view, but Jonangpas who are in eastern Tibet. And he's appointed somebody to be in charge of them and coordinate between them and him, and he gave them a monastery and so forth. But then when he talks about, who has the same view, he includes the Gagyupas, he includes the Nyingmas, to the dismay of some, other Gelugpas, but he doesn't include the Jonangpas.
Also, wasn't there some sort of banning of the Jonong and
Yeah.
the books and things like that?
Absolutely, there was. But see, it was like, I don't, we don't have that much more to go. Shall we finish on the Jonong? Okay, so we got the philosophical idea and how it's, we talked a lot about the implications. So in the there's a lot of influence from this on other sects. Some Sakyas as well and Kagyapas early on were influenced by this and adopted it. In the early 17th century, against people who were like Tsongkhapa and his followers who were criticizing it, this view was defended by Taranatha in the early 17th century. So Taranatha was like, there's also a book published by him which is his sort of defense of Dolphova against his critics. But then a short time later, in the mid-17th century, this is the time of the fifth Dalai Lama, the Great Fifth, there was like basically a rebellion against the Dalai Lama's leadership in Tibet by the king of Tsong, the leaders of the western part of the central part of Tibet. And they were like allied both with Jonong and with a lot of Kagyapa, and putting down, and the Dalai Lama has said, well, yeah, it's true that we did shut down the Jonong monastery and we took over some Kagyapa monasteries and converted them to Gelugpa use. But the fifth Dalai Lama was actually notoriously non-sectarian. He actually had a lot of other Gelugpas who were angry at him because he was really nice to the Nyingmas. He was very much into Nyingma, and he had a burn guy who went around with him all the time wherever he went. So it wasn't like he was like some, there's a really long complicated story about this, but he was generally perceived as being, within Gelugpa, as being much too broad-minded toward the other sects. So it's kind of ironic that he then ends up being the one who shuts down Jonong Monastery, puts a seal on their library, the books are banned, some of the books are burned. So you have His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama has said this was not, religious persecution, but it was basically a case of treason. In any case, however you understood it, they didn't just shut down the monastery. They actually did burn the books and seal the library, and printing area where the books were kept. And this led to a lot of people thinking that Jonong had disappeared off the face of the earth. But of course, Shendong ideas had spread outside of Jonong, but Jonong itself appeared to have disappeared. But in fact, it survived down to today in eastern Tibet, sort of far beyond the reaches of the authority of the central Tibetan government over toward China. And there are thousands of, some dozens of small monasteries of Jonong in eastern Tibet today, with not 10,000, but I don't know, 5,000 or 4,000, monks spread out among them. And they have gotten, I guess in the late 18th century, early 19th century, they got the books released by the later Dalai Lama out of the library. So they have the literature has been preserved and is sort of gradually coming to be more available, and the fact that these people still exist is now understood. So the Dalai Lama was, recognizing that these were, some of his people, appointed a Lama who is considered to be a reincarnation of Taranatha to be their leader. But not all of them are happy with that, because this guy is also in charge of all the Gelugpas in Mongolia. And so they don't really see him as one of them. But anyway, he also gave them a monastery. And so then now there are Jonong centers. I hear that even in the United States, well, I don't know specifically where, but they have English language websites, and they have some presence in outside of Tibet as well as in eastern Tibet down to today.
Do you know what the political reason for the rebellion was?
Well, The Tibetans were constantly fighting with each other. I don't know if you really read the political military history of Tibet, but we had this idea, okay, the Dalai Lama is in charge, but the Chinese were being high-handed. Well, it's like they were just fighting with each other all the time. The Sakyas were pretty much the only order that hasn't had its turn to be boss or trying to be the boss is the Nyingmas. And of course they were, they had their time in the first diffusion. But since the second, spreading of the Dharma in Tibet, all of the orders they ally themselves with different clans within Tibet, in different parts of Tibet, or with different outside powers, the Mongols or the Manchus, and then they try to get leverage on spreading their version of the Dharma. It's always been like that. I'm sorry.
I mean, they're people, right?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly, yeah. Tibetans are real people with politics. And then when they think the other people have the wrong view, then they combine their delusion with their anger about that just the way we would. Yeah, and so yeah, they were always having these fights. It was constantly, I didn't mention, when Jonah, for example, I wasn't focusing on the politics so much, but when Sherab Gyaltsen went to Lhasa for 6 months and everybody broke down the doors to hear him, his supposed reason for going was to pray to the Jo image in the Jokong in Lhasa for peace. Because there was a war going on, basically, not the Gelugpas because they didn't exist yet, right? It was basically the Sakyas and their allies were fighting against the Kagyapas and their allies and over who was going to, be in charge. The Sakyas had been in charge for about 100 years up to that time, and then they were losing power and there was fighting. Yeah. Well, I'm glad you guys are having some give and take, had a little more comfortable. I felt like it was this last year too. It was a little harder for me on the first day, and I'm jet lagged and you're not all used to me and so forth. And today we actually I didn't have to go through things and we just could explore the ideas together. So in the afternoon I'm going to try to we'll look at the Karamba text that I gave out. And I'll try to tell you what I understand about Sakya. And I was so thank you.